Good evening. The book of Revelation is a book that has caused a lot of concern, a lot of fear, a lot of debate, but at its core is a book that portrays a message that the church in the first century and the church today both need to hear and reflect upon. And that is the idea that Jesus is victorious, Jesus wins. And I appreciate Nathan reading from that passage for us. Something that his translation called out to the church there at Thyatira was to understand that there is a desire, God is calling his people to conquer, or as the New American Standard puts it, to overcome. And that is a very appropriate statement, especially in the church of Thyatira. We're going to get to consider here in just a moment. But it's a appropriate statement for all of the church throughout history to hear this call which God has set forth for us to be the people who have overcome in face of many great perils that Satan puts in front of us to draw our attention away from God. I want to consider a little bit about how the church is being described in this way. As I said this morning, we're continuing this theme. Some of you all that have talked with me before about preparing sermons have heard me kind of use this phrase, and I'm fairly certain that I just stole it from Michael, but there are a lot of things that in the preparation sermon just wind up on the cutting room floor. They don't make it into the actual lesson. And so much on this idea of what the New Testament, the verses we looked at this morning are just a small handful of the many verses that are found throughout Scripture, and especially the New Testament, revealing this issue of idolatry and the effect that it has on us. And the same thing is true about Revelation. But as I start weeding that out and saying, okay, because Robbie Bellwood called me out in class and said that Jonah only used 8 words in his sermon and kind of really put the heat on me. I've got to leave some stuff out. This idea of Revelation was something that I felt was just not something that we could leave out. And so we're going to make this one a part 2 to this morning's lesson. And I want to begin by just a very quick look at what the book of Revelation is doing, and specifically how it starts. How it begins. Revelation begins in a concept that follows after the book of Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 6 specifically opens up with this notion that God's glorious image is revealed in some way, and then you have the prophet Isaiah who is commissioned to take a message and send it out to his people. And the book of Revelation begins very similarly. In chapter 1, we see the glorious image of God in Christ being revealed, and a message that is sent out to be heard by God's people in chapters 2 and in chapters 3. Now, where they kind of differ is the fact that in Isaiah, the message was to harden their hearts, to blind them so that they would not hear, so they wouldn't repent, so they wouldn't turn away, and judgment would be brought upon them. In the book of Revelation, just as in the Gospels and just as in the writings of Paul that we saw this morning, the concept is to turn the hearts of the listener back to the Lord, or to open their eyes. And there's a sense in which it's attempting to shock someone out of a state of maybe apathy. They have kind of gotten accustomed to the world they're in and to the way that they're going, and God is trying to get their attention and shake them a little bit. And thus you hear this phrase that we see throughout the Gospels, and we're going to see it several times here in the book of Revelation: he who has an ear, let him hear. And specifically what he's trying to bring their attention to, I think could be well described as the problem, the danger of churches that have compromised. And so that's what we're going to be considering here as we go through these letters to the churches and focusing a little bit more intently on one of them. I'll leave that up for a second while we move on. So I want to just give a very quick overview of these 7 churches. We're going to consider first the church in Ephesus. That is the first one that's written to in chapter 2. And the church in Ephesus is a church that seems to have at some point had a great love for the Lord, and they have at some point turned from that. I think there is a sense when we read through these churches that maybe we tend to, kind of set them aside and go, okay, there's a church in there that I would want to belong to, and a church in there that I maybe wouldn't want to belong to. And there's a sense where maybe the church in Ephesus, we might look at it and go, okay, that's bad, but they got the right doctrine, they're teaching the right things, they just don't have a lot of emotion left in their worship. It's become very cold and rigid, and their love for the Lord is not what it was once before. That's not like some of the other churches that have just wholeheartedly, seemingly rejected and left God. But we need to make sure that we see something that's happening in these letters, that God is choosing these churches and putting them in the position that He's doing it, and writing these letters for a purpose that I think we'll be able to explain here in a moment. So Ephesus has turned from their love of the Lord. And then we get to the next church, Smyrna. Smyrna, God is one of the two churches that God writes to, and there's no complaint. There's no condemnation for what they're doing. We see God revealed in some way, Jesus revealed in some way to them, and then the message is for them to overcome, and yet He's telling them that He was visible of what was going on, that He was able to see the things that were happening in Smyrna, that they were being tested by Satan. Specifically, He describes this synagogue of Satan that was testing them there. We may have images in our mind that draw up to the persecution that the church felt through the Jews. But then going on to Pergamum, and really the next three churches, Pergamum, Thyatira, and Sardis, we're going to see things that reflect maybe the possibility, sometimes definitely the possibility, that idolatry was part of the problem. Pergamum specifically, he says that they have those there that are holding to the teaching of the Nicolaitans, and then he likens that teaching to that of Balaam, who helped lead God's people, Israel, away from a faithful relationship with Him and into idolatry through introducing women of other nations and causing them to turn from God. So he says that's going on in Pergamum. Thyatira, we're going to speak about them more in just a moment, but some of the things that are going on there revolve around idolatry. And then Sardis. Nothing is specifically said in Sardis about idolatry, but there's some words that he brings up that I think are important to key in on. One, you have a reputation or you have a name that you are alive. The image that you reflect to the world, when people think about the church there in Sardis, they think of a church that reflects the very nature of God, who is life, who has brought life to His people. And he says, but I know that you're not really that. That might be what the outward appearance is, but inside you are dead. Maybe draws our minds back to the Pharisees and some of the things that were going on there. But that idea of dead, what were they reflecting? They're reflecting the nature of what we see over and over again in idol worship. The idols were inanimate. They were not able to hear. They were not able to save. They were just dead, lifeless things. And so you have these three churches that somewhat reflect this idea of idolatry in different ways. And then you have the church at Philadelphia, the second church, in which there's no criticism placed against them. And in fact, they are told that they would be kept from the testing of Satan, possibly again this idea of the synagogue of Satan. And then to close, we have the church at Laodicea, which is pretty clear to see things are very wrong at Laodicea, that they had this notion that everything was well, but God says, if you could really see what I see, you'd see that you are wretched, you are naked and blind, amongst other things. I hope, given our focus this year on idolatry, that some of the language here sounds familiar. And I hope that at the very least, we see that with the majority of these churches, the concept of becoming like what you worship, that concept would indicate that God has been shifted from a place of worship and something else has been put in as the object of their reverence. And that would mean that when when Jesus writes to each one of these churches, He closes it with the same phrase, the phrase that we should be accustomed to by now. He who has an ear, let him hear. It tells us what the purpose of these letters are to do. They are to open their eyes. They are to wake them up, but they're also indicating that there were those there that would listen, and there were also those there who would not listen as well. Now, we're not going to get into all the symbology of the book of Revelation, and I'm going to go ahead and admit right now, there are probably those here today that are not going to agree with every correlation I make between the figurative and the this context in which the book is written in, the reality of the day. But what I do hope we will be able to do is to plainly see the very thing that we have been studying. The book of Revelation contains a pattern of idol worshipers beginning to reflect the nature of the idols they have raised up. It is evident within this book. It is written directly to Christians, and therefore it should get our attention. If this could happen in the first century, this could happen today as well. So, just a couple points that we're going to consider for this evening. One is Revelation chapter 2 and 3 is a chiasm. We've talked about that, this notion of kind of a repeating pattern that is seen there. And it's a chiasm of compromise, is what we're calling this. So, just to kind of bring this back up, maybe some of you are not familiar with this, or some of you have forgotten since last time we talked about it. But you have this pattern that is kind of seen here in the book, this ABC, CCBA. So we're going to work our way into the pattern and we're going to work our way back out. And what I want you to notice is the A, the first part of this pattern, are churches that just really seem to have it described the worst out of all of them. Churches that he says, look, you were in love with God, but you're not in love with God anymore. This is a marriage relationship. The wife is not in love with the husband. That relationship is fractured and broken. And comparing that with also Laodicea, a church that should be and sees itself as a church that is alive and well and growing. He says, look, I see you how you really are. This is a messed up relationship. This is a broken relationship. You're wretched, blind, and naked. And then in the middle of this concept are these three churches, the three C's here, all of which have some sort of problem with idolatry. And I want to talk for a minute why Thyatira, I think, is at the center of this. But what's crazy is in this 7 churches that God singles out and writes to. By the way, I think it is important for us to consider that this is figurative language, and there is a great likelihood that the reason for 7 churches is this is a complete number, this is a divine number, and it's a picture of God's people. And what do we find amongst God's people? The same thing we found in Israel, that there seems to be a remnant. There is a great number of the body of God's people who are dealing with problems. They need to wake up. And it's a small amount that he says, I don't have a complaint to. You need to continue to overcome. And we have a very small group in this sampling of churches, Smyrna and Philadelphia. They're the minority. The majority of God's people that he writes to here have all sorts of problems. And it makes you wonder, we're not that far removed from the days of Jesus and the writing of Paul and his apostles going around and teaching and spreading the good news of Jesus. How did we get to this? How did Ephesus get from a church that was thriving and growing to a church that looks like they've lost their first love? How do we get here? And I think the church at Thyatira may give an answer to that. The complaint against them that he brings is that they tolerated the woman Jezebel. It seemingly had led some to adopting her teaching, and as was described, those who have known the deep things of Satan. For those of you that like lists, if you could just make a list of the scary things that the Bible talks about. I think for some of us, but maybe some of our younger kids, we might talk about Behemoth and Leviathan. Those are pretty scary sounding creatures. The flood, that was a terrifying thing. But the deep things of Satan, I think would have to rank pretty high on the list of scary things. And yet he says there are those there that have known the deep things of Satan, seemingly connected to what this Jezebel figure was teaching, and the fact that was allowed to go on and to grow within the church at Thyatira. Now, what do we know about this woman, Jezebel? Remember, this is a figure, this is figurative language. So what do we know about the character in which he's using to describe what's going on here in Thyatira? Well, we know that we might remember, she is the queen of Ahab. She was an authority figure. She had power. But her name literally is a praise to the false god Baal. It was a praise of this god, and she, likened to her name, praised Baal and supported that worship, tried to institute it amongst God's people to the extent to where she tried to kill and destroy the prophets of Yahweh, to stamp that out and to replace it with the worship of the God that she served. She was a very evil woman. And at the end of her life, she is thrown down from a high place and she is devoured by dogs. That's how her life ends. Now, who exactly this figure is, this woman described as Jezebel, I don't really think it matters. We can argue and try to figure out, well, what exactly was going on in Thyatira? Who is this character? I'm not sure that it matters, but I do believe that we can understand enough about her character to make some assumptions. Assumptions such as whoever it is they're talking about was likely someone with authority, someone with power, someone who hated Yahweh in the sense that we know him through the way that he was described by Jesus Christ. They stood opposed to that picture of our God. They were someone who sought to lead others in worship of other gods, or worship at least apart from the way that God had been prescribed to be worshiped by Christ. And they were willing to do that likely at any cost, maybe even putting to death those that stood opposed to them. That might be some of the things that we might correlate to this character when they're described as Jezebel. Now we're going to see some more connection to this here in just a moment. This Old Testament character, Jezebel, her qualities are going to come up again. But I want to consider just once more before we go on, that in the first century, in this church at Thyatira, whoever this figure was, it was someone who should have been openly, dogmatically, emphatically rejected, and the church should have stood and said, we are not going to allow this to go on in our number. We're going to take a stand against this. And yet, God describes them as having tolerated Jezebel, as opposed to standing against her, tolerated. Now, I wonder if maybe that's the reason why God appears to them. The Son of God, in verse 18, who has eyes like a flame of fire and feet like burnished bronze. In many cases, you see the way the images of Jesus that are portrayed at the beginning of the letter reflect something about what the church needs. And they needed to have eyes open to what was going on. And they needed to have feet like bronze that would plant themselves and say, we are standing opposed to what is being taught here. But instead, they tolerated it. Now, for those of you that like a good Greek word study, those of you that like to get into the words, this word translated tolerate is the word aphiemi. And aphiemi is a word that we see most often translated as forgive. That's a very important word to us as Christians. Forgiveness. We seek that. We are told to give that. And yet, here it would be maybe permissible to translate what is going on at Thyatira is that they forgive the teaching of Jezebel, or they made excuse for it. They permitted it to go on. But in some way, instead of recognizing the danger, instead of recognizing the way that it was opposed to the will of God, they turned a blind eye to it. They ignored it. They allowed it to continue. And this is a compromise. It is a compromise that the church in Thyatira was willing to accept with whoever this figure is. Now, I do think there's some things that we need to understand about that being a compromise. One, it is most certain that the church at Thyatira still recognized God as God. They are likened unto Israel in that way. Israel never came to a point where they said, okay, you know what? God doesn't exist. God doesn't matter. Their life might have shown that, but they weren't willing to say that. They continued to hold God up as, okay, He is God, but we're also going to throw in all these other gods to worship alongside Him. So I don't think that it's the church at Thyatira accepted their idols, any idol was greater than God, but they had maybe succumbed to the promises of those idols. Because just like in the days of Israel, the idols in the days of the church of Thyatira made promises. Promises mainly of economic prosperity. When you go back to Baal and you look at Ashtoreth and the other gods that are kind of even sometimes lumped in under those same names, when you look at all this, repeatedly what you find is a promise giver. Someone who says, look, you worship me, you'll be prosperous in your pregnancy. You worship me, you'll be prosperous in your harvest. You worship me, your kingdom will expand and become more prosperous. Over and over again, It's a promise of prosperity that these false gods offer. And the same thing is true of the gods in the days of the Greek and Roman times as well. There are economic advantages to following after these gods. And so it doesn't seem that the church at Thyatira would have said, we just outright reject Yahweh. We're willing to make a compromise, maybe because we expect we might gain some sort of benefit by allowing this teaching to go on. And under the influence of this Jezebel, the Christians saw no inconsistency in that thinking. So compromise is the right word, I believe. It's the right word to use here. They were compromising with this Jezebel figure, and it compromised their relationship with God. But it also compromised their responsibility to be unwavering, to be fixed, to be standing firm against this pagan society that they lived in. Maybe the concept is we'll allow a little bit of culture to influence us for the sake of maybe safety for our congregation, or maybe for larger crowds, or for benefits that might come through that. So compromise, I believe, is the right word. And like the Old Testament Jezebel, God says, I'm going to throw this character down. You see that? I'm going to throw her onto a bed of sickness, but I'm going to throw her down in some way. And just like that figure, we also need to see that those who followed after her were going to face this same judgment. Not only was Jezebel going to be thrown down, but he says her children will suffer with her. Her children will be destroyed. And we talked this morning about the idea of sonship. The focus here, what God is saying, is that those who reflect the same character, the same nature of this figure, Jezebel, that we're talking about, they're going to suffer. They're going to go through judgment the same way that this figure is as well. All who resemble her character are going to share in her destruction. And this message wasn't just for Thyatira. And this might be why Thyatira makes up the center of that pattern that we saw. Because out of all the churches, every church ends with that phrase, he who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Every single church gets that letter, ends the same way. Thyatira is the only one that in the midst of their letter, God says, when people see what I do here, let all the churches take note. Because I am the judge, and you will be judged for your deeds. And so Thyatira may be the center of this, because this is what leads to all the other things that are going on. What happens when churches compromise is what leads to a church leaving their first love. It's what leads to a church looking at themselves and saying, hey, look how great we are, but instead we are really blind and naked and wretched. It is maybe found at the core of Thyatira, the seed that is planted that leads to destruction. Now, one last point as we move on, and that is about this concept or this character of Jezebel, is Revelation 17. Revelation 17 is going to go on and talk about this mysterious woman named Babylon, and I do believe. Personally, I believe there's ample evidence to suggest that what we're talking about in Revelation 17 is Rome. And I know that not all hold that view. What I want you to consider, not for the purpose of persuading your thought, not for the purpose of changing where you've stood on dates and figures and who they are, but just simply what I want you to consider is that the possibility that the woman talked about in Revelation 17 and the Jezebel talked about in Revelation 2 are the same person. And they're describing the same character. This is the reason why I want to consider this. In this chapter, in chapter 17, we see some, as the message turns to this figure, we learn some things about the fate of the woman from chapter 2, and we see some of the similarities in chapter 17. In chapter 2, the woman was going to be thrown down like Jezebel of old. See, that's going to be her end. And so she's likened, she's called Jezebel. She's likened unto Jezebel in her end. And I think we see some similarities to that in Revelation 17. So verse 3, Revelation 17, verse 3 says, he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. Now, this figure of the beast began back in chapter 13. We're actually going to look at that in a moment. But there's a very close relationship with this beast, who is a figure of power and authority that is given its authority by a dragon, which is a representation of Satan. And so there is a close relationship between a figure of power that was evil, that was wicked. I think we might see a similarity there between that and the character of the Old Testament figure of Jezebel. She also, in verse 15, you want to scroll on down a little bit to verse 15, says, he said to me, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. So again, we see this picture of a position of authority. But then key in on verses 16 and 17. The 10 horns which you saw, and the beast, these will hate the harlot, will make her desolate and naked, will eat her flesh, and will burn her up with fire. For God has put it in their hearts to execute His purpose by having a common purpose and by giving their kingdom to the beast till the words of God would be fulfilled. God prophesies this figure, this woman who is in a position of power and authority, which is evil and wicked, is going to be destroyed, is going to be brought down in some way. And the way that he describes that is her having her flesh torn. Very similar to the very figure that we've considered in chapter 2, Jezebel, who was thrown from a height and killed by dogs, then eating her flesh and carrying off her bones. Now, all that right there, does that just prove the identity of the woman in Revelation 17? Absolutely not. It doesn't in any way. That's not the purpose of what I'm trying to do. I just want us to think about there are some connections that we see in this figure going back to chapter 2. And then on some level, it indicates that likely the worship of idols, which offered prosperity, let's catch this back up here, sorry. The worship of idols that offered prosperity, the church had compromised themselves with by tolerating the teaching of someone. It may have been directly related to what we see in chapter 17, which was connected to the worshiping of the kingdoms of men. Now, whether you take that kingdoms of men and liken it to the Jewish nation and the worship of a defunct temple and false worship of Yahweh, or you take it and apply it to the church being in a relationship with the nation of Rome and under their power in which they ought not have been. What we need to see is either way, the church in the first century was supposed to be a bastion against the pagan culture in which it stood. They were supposed to stand firm against it, not compromise in a way that would lead to their ruin. But that's what we see happening in the church at Thyatira, and that's what we see occurring throughout some of the passages later on in the book of Revelation. In Revelation 13, I mentioned this, we're going to spend just a little bit of time here looking at this as well. There's a few things to consider as we begin wrapping this up. There is no chapter in the book of Revelation that is more devoted to the idea of idolatry than Revelation chapter 13. It begins with a dragon, which is a representation of Satan, calling a beast up from the sea. Now, I just want you to consider this before we go on. Go back in your mind. This is just a side point. You can tuck away and bring up an interesting conversation sometime. Go back to Genesis. Genesis chapter 1, Genesis chapter 2. God is creating all things. He has created all life within the universe, and on earth He has created the animals and the fishes, and everything is created, and He creates man. And what does He say? He says, man, you are going to have dominion over my creation. And what did that include? You're going to have dominion over the beasts of the field. Now we get over to Revelation 13, and what do we find? That this figure of Satan, the demon, has raised up a beast, and that beast is ruling over, has dominion over mankind. It is a picture. Why does God describe it this way? Was there literally some sort of nine-armed, multi-eyed monster that came out of the ocean? No, that's not at all what he's trying to describe. But we need to see everything's upside down. This is not at all what God had in mind with His creation. It's completely topsy-turvy when instead of mankind having dominion over the beasts, beasts are used to show dominion over mankind. And maybe it's a picture that God's creation is ruling over man. What did we see in Romans chapter 1? The very same argument. That we exchange the glory, the image of a piece of God's creation rather than the glory of the Creator. I think we see a picture of that here. Again, just a side point. So how do people respond to this beast? They follow it and they worship it. They're amazed by it. And they also worship that which gave it authority, the dragon. I think we need to see something in this, and that is the connection to Jesus and God is seen very vibrantly here, but here it is in contrast to what we see happening there. Jesus came to this earth and he performed many signs and wonders which caused people to marvel, and they were amazed, and he invited them to worship him, and he recognized that authority came from God, and he draws their attention to see God and worship God in the correct way, in a true and spiritual way through him. This is in direct opposition to what God has done. And thus he blasphemes God. The beast blasphemes God, and he's covered in these blasphemous names. And those who are following him and those who are worshiping him, what do we know about them? Well, one, we know that they're not the saints here. Revelation 13, it's not the saints, because what he says there is that the beast made war against the saints. So it's not the saints that are worshiping him, but he describes them in verse 8 and in verse 12 and twice in verse 14 as earth dwellers. Revelation 13, verse 8. Let's look at that one. It says, and they were, I'm in the wrong passage, that's 12. Revelation 8:13, all who dwell on the earth will worship him. Everyone whose name has not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who had been slain. All who dwell on the earth. This phrase is going to be used a couple times here, and it's used elsewhere outside of this passage as well. And each time it's used, it's referring to the evil and unbelieving idol worshipers of the world that were following after the beast. Why call them this? Why is it that God singles them out, and as he describes them, he says, hey, these are the earth dwellers that are doing these things? Is it because their hope and their trust lied within some earthly created object? Another way we might also say what we saw in Romans 1, that the created rather than the creator. How is that different from what God has called us to be? He's called us to be sojourners. He's called us to be pilgrims. We're not dwelling on earth. We're passing through on our way to our true home with God. That's where our security lies. Not in what this world has to offer, but the hope of our new home with God in heaven. So we are not to be dwellers on earth. Once again, Romans chapter 13 and verse 9, and this is actually maybe just another side point, the very last time this phrase is used in the Bible, the very last time we'll see it used, Revelation 13 verse 9, if anyone has an ear, let him hear. This language, again, illustrates that God is trying to wake people up. Understand this. And the use of that language should also tell us that there are going to be those who will have a heart and will have eyes that are spiritually open to God, and they will hear the message and they will repent, but there will also be those who will not listen. In chapter 13, we're going to kind of draw this to a close in verses 16 through 18. What was going to be the result of all this? There were going to be those who worshiped the beast. There were going to be those who didn't worship the beast, and they were going to be slain, they were going to be killed. But there were going to be those who worshiped the beast, and they were going to be identified with the beast. Now he talks about they're going to receive a mark, and a great injustice has been done by this concept in the world. But when he describes this, what he is describing is simply they're going to be identified in some way with the idol or with the power, with whatever it is that they were worshiping. In some way, they were going to be identified. We saw that this morning, that how when you join something, you join yourself to an idol, you identify, you become one with that idol. And the same thing is being described here in Revelation 13 as all this comes to an end, that they were going to receive a mark. And I want you to think about that in contrast to what God has said. When you went into the world, the figure that they're describing here in Revelation 13, I belong to this, I have worshiped it, and I have the mark to show that in my life. In some way, I am reflecting that to the world, that I belong to this sort of worship. People see it. That's the idea that is described there. It's a mark on the hand and on the forehead. It's a mark that people are going to be able to tell you belong to beast worship. You're an earth dweller. How is that in contrast to the people who belong to God, who have his name written upon their forehead, who are identified with belonging to him? We talked about Moses before. We talked about him again this morning. You remember he comes down from Mount Sinai, and depending on how you read it, he's got a horn growing out the front of his head. You think people would notice that? For those of you that weren't here for that, Moses' face shone when he came down from Mount Sinai. There's some very old translations that take that idea that he was horned, that the glory of God emanated like a horn out of his head, maybe to kind of get the attention of the people that were worshiping a calf, to say, hey, I see what you're doing. That's not what's supposed to be going on. But nonetheless, can you imagine you go into school tomorrow, you go to your jobs tomorrow, and as you walk in, a horn of light is shining out. People are going to go, that dude is different. There is something kind of off about them. They got a light bulb sticking out of their forehead. They are very different. But just like the people who worship the beast and are dwellers upon the earth are marked, and it is evident that their identity is this, those who worship God should be just as evident. That their life reveals who they worship, who it is that they put first. I think here, maybe better than anywhere else in the New Testament, we see a very clear image that when we set something up to worship, whether it be an idol or whether it be the God and creator of all things, it has an impact upon us. We will begin to reflect that which we revere. Now, as I said, this was describing earth dwellers. That's who he's talking about here. Those whose trust was in the created, not the creator. Let us not be guilty of maybe the same thing that the church at Laodicea might have thought. Looking at ourselves and saying, it sure is a good thing I'm not like them. I'm not an earth dweller. That ain't written to me. That's written to people that are worshiping after. We've joked around in Robbie's class. We're going to redefine the word woke. So these people think they're woke, but they're not really woke. I know better. Because that's not a problem for God's real people. Let's close with one last passage. Revelation chapter 18. Revelation chapter 18, God announces the overthrow of this figure, Babylon, the woman. He describes that is going to happen. But verse 4 should get our attention. He says, I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, you bunch of earth dwellers. He said, come out of her, my people. Come out of her, Christians. Come out of her, those whose names are in the Lamb's book of life. Come out of her, those whose God's name is stamped across your forehead. Come out of those who have committed themselves to reflecting the glory of God. Because it is a real danger for churches, for Christians, to compromise with the culture and become a part of it. It says, come out from the culture that you stand against and stand firm with God. Because if we don't, we will share in their destruction. We're not going to talk about it tonight, but I encourage you to think of the nature and the figure of Lot and Lot's wife. Come out of her or share in her destruction. This was a threat to the church in that day. The compromise with a wicked culture that they lived in. To exchange their glory, the God of heaven that they worshiped and whose character they were to reflect to the world, for that which was profitless and that which was vain. And the church today can still compromise, and we can still exchange the glory of God for worthless and profitless and vain promises of security and peace. I hope we will learn from the 7 churches of Asia which he writes to, that we will be vigilant and hold fast to our first love, that we will view ourselves with spiritual eyes that are open and see us for who we are, that we will seek our value from God and from Him alone. I pray that we will prepare ourselves for testing and recognize the influence that Satan has, our accuser, our adversary, and that he will throw into our path every manner of stumbling block and hurdle, trying to focus our minds away from things above where Christ's habitation is and onto things of this life. I pray that we will never compromise with the culture that we live in, no matter what the reputation may be, No matter what the influence or the power that the teacher that brings that compromise to us, I pray that we will commit ourselves always to overcome. And please hear, when I say the church needs to do this, I'm talking about you and me. We are the church. And together with the elders that shepherd this flock and with the individuals that go out into the world, we need to stand firm. For he who has an ear, let him hear. If you are here today and you realize that I've been dwelling on the earth, my hope is not secured in heaven with Christ because my focus has been on the things of this world, or if you are here today and you have made a commitment to shed this worldly life and put on a spiritual life with Christ, and you are sojourning and pilgriming your way to heaven, but along the way, the lies and the promises, the vain promises that this world has have pulled your attention back, I'd have you think about the closing words, the opening words and the closing words of the book of Revelation. Christ is victorious. Not the world, not the dragon, not the beast. Christ is victorious. And Christ is coming quickly. I pray that we all can pray together, "Come, Lord Jesus, come." But I definitely pray together that His grace may be upon us. If you are in need of that tonight, please come forward right now and let's discuss it together as we stand and as we sing.